The room went silent the second my aunt slammed a stack of papers onto the table. She forged Grandma's signature, Aunt Brenda announced, loud enough for everyone at the memorial luncheon to hear. She stole the house right out from under us. Welcome to Revenge Stories with Jolene, the channel where quiet people finally get their truth heard. If you believe family should never use grief as a weapon, like this video, subscribe, and stay until the end, because this story still gives me chills. My name is Eleanor Price. I was 32 years old, sitting in the same dining room where I had eaten Sunday dinners my entire life, watching my own family turn against me in less than 30 seconds. My cousins stared at me like I was a stranger. My uncle called me a criminal under his breath. My own mother sat frozen, her fork still in her hand, too stunned to speak. Aunt Brenda pointed at the papers. "Confess now," she said, "or I'm calling the police." Tears burned in my eyes, but I had nothing to confess. I had never touched those documents. Before I could find my voice, the front doorbell rang, sharp and sudden, cutting through the silence like a blade. Nobody moved. Aunt Brenda's eyes flicked toward the hallway, then quickly away, as if she could somehow will the sound to stop. "Ignore it," she said. "We are not finished here." But Uncle Richard had already pushed back his chair. He walked to the door and opened it before anyone could stop him. Standing on the porch was an older man in a grey coat, holding a leather folder under one arm. I recognized the name printed on his business card the moment he introduced himself. Mr. Harrison. The notary whose stamp appeared at the bottom of the very papers Aunt Brenda had just thrown onto the table. For one brief second, I watched something flicker across my aunt's face. Fear, sharp and unmistakable, before she smoothed it into a tight, practiced smile. "Mr. Harrison," she said sweetly. "What a surprise." He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes already moving toward the papers spread across the table. He picked one up, adjusted his glasses, and studied it carefully. Then his expression changed completely, the polite professionalism draining away into something far more serious. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Mr. Harrison set the document down slowly, his fingers still resting on the edge of the page. "I need to say something important," he announced. "While this seal does belong to me, I never notarized these papers." The room fell into stunned silence. Aunt Brenda's composure cracked instantly. "That's impossible," she snapped. "You must be confused. You're getting older, you probably forgot." Mr. Harrison did not flinch. "My records are precise," he said calmly. "I keep a log of every appointment I perform, every signature I witness. There is no entry matching this date, this document, or this client." I felt something loosen in my chest, the first small thread of relief since this entire nightmare began. Aunt Brenda kept arguing, her voice rising with every sentence, insisting he was mistaken, insisting his memory was failing him, insisting this was somehow still my fault. Mr. Harrison simply waited for her to finish. Then he asked one quiet question that silenced the entire room. "Where is the original file your mother kept for documents like this?" Nobody answered right away. Because nobody actually knew. Everyone moved at once, chairs scraping against the floor as the family rushed upstairs toward Grandma's old office. I followed close behind, my heart pounding against my ribs. The office looked exactly the way Grandma had always kept it, neat and orderly, every drawer labeled in her careful handwriting. But when Uncle Richard pulled open the bottom drawer where she stored her most important papers, it was completely empty. No folders. No envelopes. Nothing but dust outlining where stacks of documents used to sit. Aunt Brenda turned toward me immediately. "She emptied it herself," she said. "This proves everything." I opened my mouth to defend myself, but Grandma's caretaker, a quiet woman named Priscilla who had cared for her during her final 2 years, stepped forward instead. "Only one person besides your mother had a spare key to this room," she said carefully. The room went still. "And it wasn't Eleanor," Priscilla added. Every eye in that office turned slowly toward Aunt Brenda. Her face went pale, just for a moment, before she forced an irritated laugh and waved the comment away like it meant nothing at all. But I had seen her expression, and I knew exactly what it meant. Priscilla continued quietly, her voice steady despite the tension filling the room. Your grandmother told me something a few weeks before she passed, she said. She looked at me very seriously and said, if anything happens, trust Eleanor. Aunt Brenda laughed sharply, the sound brittle and forced. Grandma was getting senile by then, she said. She barely knew what day it was. Something hot rose in my chest hearing her insult Grandma like that, twisting her memory to protect her own lies. She was not senile, I said, my voice shaking but clear. She remembered everyone's birthdays until the day she died. My mother, who had been silent this entire time, suddenly looked up from her hands. Wait, she said slowly. I remember something now. Mom mentioned once, almost in passing, that she had made a backup copy of something important. She said she hid it somewhere nobody would think to look. The entire room turned toward her. Where? Aunt Brenda demanded immediately, her composure slipping again. My mother shook her head slowly. I don't know, she admitted. She never told me exactly where. But the seed had been planted. Somewhere in this house, the truth was still waiting to be found. My brother stepped forward before anyone else could speak, his expression cold and unfamiliar. Give me your keys to this house, he said, holding out his hand toward me. Right now. I stared at him, stunned. You actually believe her? He did not answer directly, which told me everything I needed to know. Around the room, my cousins whispered to each other, glancing my way with suspicion instead of sympathy. Someone near the kitchen muttered the word greedy loud enough for me to hear clearly. Another cousin pulled out his phone, threatening quietly to call the police if I did not cooperate immediately. Completely abandoned by the people who were supposed to know me best, I felt something inside me finally break. I walked upstairs, pulled my small overnight bag from the guest closet, and began packing with shaking hands, tears blurring my vision. I was halfway down the stairs when the doorbell rang again. This time, Grandma's oldest friend, a woman named Dorothy who had known her for nearly 50 years, stood on the porch holding a sealed envelope against her chest. Her eyes found mine immediately through the crowd. Eleanor, she said softly, I think this belongs to you. Dorothy stepped inside, ignoring the tense silence filling the room, and placed the envelope gently into my hands. Your grandmother gave this to me months ago, she explained. She told me to deliver it only if conflict broke out in this family after she was gone. My hands trembled as I broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. Grandma's handwriting filled the page, slightly shaky toward the end, but unmistakably hers. She wrote about love, about family, about the importance of truth outlasting lies. Then, near the bottom, one sentence stood out clearly above the rest. The truth is hidden where memories began. I read it 3 times, my mind racing through every conversation, every memory, every place Grandma had ever mentioned with that particular kind of fondness in her voice. Aunt Brenda leaned over my shoulder, trying to read the letter herself. What does that even mean? She asked sharply. This is ridiculous. But something inside me understood immediately, a memory surfacing clearly through the chaos of the day. The attic. Grandma's old photo albums, the ones she used to pull out every Christmas, telling stories about her childhood and her wedding and the early years of raising her own children. That was where memories began. I climbed the narrow attic stairs with several family members trailing close behind me, including Aunt Brenda, who insisted on watching every move I made. The attic smelled like cedar and old paper, exactly the way it always had. Stacks of photo albums sat along the far wall, organized by decade in Grandma's careful handwriting on the spines. I pulled out the oldest album first, the one labeled simply with the year of her wedding. Tucked carefully between 2 pages near the back, hidden beneath a folded photograph, was a small brass key. The moment Aunt Brenda saw it, her face drained of color completely. That's mine, she said quickly, reaching for it. I must have left that here years ago. I held it back, my fingers closing tightly around the cold metal. You don't even know what it opens, I said calmly. She had no answer for that. Uncle Richard stepped between us, his voice firm for the first time all day. Let's find out together, he said. All of us. Aunt Brenda's protests grew louder, but nobody listened anymore. Something had shifted in the room, a quiet suspicion finally taking root in people who had been so quick to condemn me only hours earlier. We carried the key downstairs, searching for whatever lock it belonged to. We found it behind Grandma's bookshelf, a small metal safe built directly into the wall, hidden so well that most of us had never even noticed it existed. My hands shook as I fit the brass key into the lock. It turned smoothly, and the small door swung open. Everyone leaned forward, expecting to find the real will, proof that would finally end this nightmare once and for all. Instead, the safe was almost completely empty. Inside sat a single folded note, written in Grandma's familiar handwriting. "Someone close to me cannot be trusted." That was all it said. No name. No explanation. Just a warning that suddenly felt heavier than anything else that had happened all day. Uncle Richard examined the edges of the safe door more closely, running his fingers along the lock mechanism. "Look at this," he said quietly, pointing towards small scratch marks near the latch. "Someone forced this open recently. These marks are fresh." The room fell silent again. Someone had already been here before us, searching for whatever Grandma had hidden, and they had left behind only this single warning. I looked directly at Aunt Brenda. She refused to meet my eyes. The tension in the room had barely settled when my cousin Nicole suddenly spoke up from the corner, her voice trembling. "Mom borrowed a lot of money last year," she said quietly. "She's been behind on the mortgage for months." I wasn't supposed to say anything. Aunt Brenda spun toward her daughter immediately, her face flushing with anger. "Nicole, that is not relevant right now." But it was too late. The words were already out, hanging in the air between everyone in that room. For the first time since the accusations began, I watched something shift in the faces around me. My uncle's expression hardened. My mother's eyes narrowed slightly. Even my brother, who had demanded my keys only hours earlier, glanced toward Aunt Brenda with a flicker of doubt. "Is that true?" Uncle Richard asked slowly. Aunt Brenda's composure cracked just slightly, her voice rising defensively. "Everyone has financial struggles sometimes. That doesn't mean anything." But the timing felt impossible to ignore. Grandma's death. The missing documents. The empty safe. And now, financial desperation is serious enough to keep secret from her own family. Nicole would not look at her mother. For the first time all day, I was not the only person under suspicion in that room. Later that evening, while most of the family argued quietly in the living room, Aunt Brenda mentioned almost casually that Grandma's old attorney had retired years earlier and could not be reached for comment. I did not believe her, though I had no proof to argue otherwise. Then, just before 9 that night, my mother's phone rang with an unfamiliar number. She answered hesitantly, then went completely still, her eyes widening as she listened. "It's Mr. Coleman," she whispered, covering the receiver with her hand. "Grandma's attorney." The entire room froze. Mr. Coleman explained that he had been trying to reach the family for nearly 3 weeks, ever since Grandma's passing. He said he had called repeatedly, but every number he tried showed as blocked or disconnected. My mother glanced toward Aunt Brenda, who suddenly seemed very interested in something on her phone screen. "Someone blocked his calls," my mother said slowly, the realization settling over her face. Mr. Coleman asked if he could come by the following morning to discuss something important regarding Grandma's actual estate plans, something he insisted needed to be handled in person rather than over the phone. My mother agreed immediately. For the first time that entire day, I felt something steadier than fear settle into my chest. The truth was finally finding its way back to us. Mr. Coleman arrived early the next morning carrying a small recording device along with a thin folder of documents. He explained that Grandma had visited his office just 2 months before her death, specifically to make changes to her estate plans. During that visit, she had recorded a short statement explaining her reasoning, in case anyone ever questioned her decisions later. He pressed play, and Grandma's voice filled the room, calm and steady despite how frail she had become near the end. "I am changing certain parts of my estate," her recorded voice said, "because one member of this family has continued demanding money from me for years, using guilt and pressure I am no longer willing to tolerate." Every head in the room slowly turned toward Aunt Brenda. "That could mean anyone," she said quickly, her voice sharp with panic. "She never said my name." But her hands were trembling as she said it, and everyone in that room could see it clearly. Mr. Coleman continued, explaining that Grandma had been specific about protecting certain assets, particularly the house, from anyone who might try to manipulate her trust after she was gone. The recording ended, but the silence that followed felt louder than anything spoken that entire week. Just as Mr. Coleman finished gathering his papers, the front door opened, and Grandma's former in-home nurse, a woman named Carla, stepped inside, her expression nervous and uncertain. "I heard what happened," she said quietly. "I should have said something a long time ago." She explained that during one of her shifts nearly a year earlier, she had overheard Aunt Brenda arguing loudly with Grandma in the next room. Grandma had been crying, begging her daughter to stop asking for money she did not have to give. Carla admitted she had stayed silent out of fear, worried about losing her position if she said anything against a family member. "But that's not all," she continued, glancing nervously toward Aunt Brenda. "Your grandmother had someone else present when she signed her final documents. A witness, separate from anyone here today." The room went completely still. "Who?" I asked immediately. Carla hesitated, clearly searching her memory. "An older woman," she said slowly. "I believe her name was Mrs. Peterson. She used to visit sometimes in the afternoons." Nobody in the room recognized the name immediately, but the possibility of an independent witness, someone with no stake in this family's conflict, felt like the breakthrough we desperately needed. "That woman moved overseas months ago," Aunt Brenda said quickly, her voice tight with forced confidence. "There's no point searching for her. She's impossible to reach now." I did not believe her, not after everything that had already happened that week. My mother pulled out her phone and began searching online for anyone matching that name in our area, scrolling through old neighborhood directories and community center records while the rest of the family watched in tense silence. Minutes passed without success. Then, just as my mother was about to give up, my own phone buzzed unexpectedly in my pocket. I glanced down at the screen. An unfamiliar number, with no name attached. My hands trembled slightly as I answered, half expecting another threat or argument from someone in the family. "Hello," I said cautiously. An older woman's voice answered on the other end, warm but slightly confused. "Hello, dear," she said. "I'm so sorry to call out of the blue like this. My name is Mrs. Peterson. Someone mentioned you might be looking for me." I nearly dropped the phone. The witness Aunt Brenda claimed had vanished overseas was calling me directly, completely unaware of everything happening inside this house. I put the call on speaker so the entire family could hear, my hand still shaking slightly from the shock of it. Mrs. Peterson explained that she had been hospitalized for several weeks after a serious fall and had only just returned home, completely unaware that Grandma had even passed away. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "I would have come immediately if I had known." I asked her gently if she remembered being present when Grandma signed her final documents. "Of course I do," she said without hesitation. I sat right beside her. She was perfectly clear, perfectly sharp that day. She read every page carefully before signing anything. Aunt Brenda's face had gone completely pale, though she said nothing. Then Mrs. Peterson added something unexpected. "Actually, now that you mention it," she said slowly, "I remember a woman coming in right afterward, asking me very strange questions. She wanted to know exactly what Grandma had said, what document she had signed, whether anyone else had seen them." "Do you remember her name?" I asked carefully. Mrs. Peterson paused, thinking. "I believe it was Brenda," she said finally. "Yes, that's right. Brenda." The room fell into stunned, heavy silence. The witness Aunt Brenda swore had disappeared had just confirmed everything we suspected about her. The following afternoon, Mr. Coleman suggested we contact Grandma's assisted living facility directly, since most modern facilities keep security footage on file for safety purposes. After several phone calls and a brief wait, the facility manager agreed to share footage from the weeks surrounding Grandma's passing. We gathered around my mother's laptop that evening, watching grainy black and white footage of the hallway outside Grandma's old room. Then we saw it. Late one night, well after visiting hours had ended, a familiar figure walked quietly down the hallway, glancing nervously over her shoulder before slipping into Grandma's room. Aunt Brenda. Several minutes later, the footage showed her leaving again, this time carrying a thick folder tucked tightly under one arm. I was just helping organize her paperwork, Aunt Brenda said quickly, though her voice had lost most of its earlier confidence. That's all that was. Nobody believed her anymore. The timestamp on the footage matched almost exactly with the date Grandma's original documents had gone missing from her office drawer. Uncle Richard stared at the screen for a long moment before finally speaking. You need to start telling the truth, he said quietly. Right now. Aunt Brenda said nothing at all, staring down at her hands instead of meeting anyone's eyes. That same evening, Nicole finally broke down completely, sobbing as she admitted something she had been holding back since this entire situation began. Mom asked me to help her months ago, she said through tears. She told me we were scanning Grandma's old signatures to make a memory scrapbook for her birthday. I didn't know what it was really for. I swear I didn't know. The room went deathly quiet. She had me scan dozens of pages, Nicole continued. Old cards, letters, anything with Grandma's handwriting on it. I thought it was sweet at the time. Suddenly, the forged signature on those original documents made horrifying sense. Aunt Brenda had not simply copied Grandma's signature by hand. She had collected digital samples of it, carefully, methodically, over several months, preparing for exactly this moment. My mother covered her mouth with one hand, clearly horrified by how calculated this entire scheme truly was. You used your own daughter, Uncle Richard said slowly, looking at Aunt Brenda with something close to disgust. Aunt Brenda finally looked up, her eyes wet but her expression still defensive. I never meant for it to go this far, she said weakly. But the damage was already done, and everyone in that room understood exactly what she had been planning from the very beginning. The police arrived the following morning, accompanied by a handwriting specialist Mr. Coleman had personally recommended for cases involving suspected forgery. I expected the analysis to take weeks, maybe even months, based on what I had seen in television crime shows over the years. Instead, the specialist examined the documents for less than an hour before delivering her findings directly to the detective standing beside her. These signatures were not written by hand, she explained clearly. They show consistent pixel patterns and unnatural pressure variations that only appear when a signature has been copied electronically and reproduced multiple times. She pointed towards several spots on the document where the ink density matched perfectly across different pages, something a real handwritten signature would never produce naturally. Someone scanned an original signature, she continued, then digitally placed it onto these documents before printing them. The detective turned toward Aunt Brenda, who had gone completely silent throughout the entire explanation. We'll need to ask you some additional questions, he said firmly. Down at the station. Aunt Brenda's hands trembled as she gathered her purse, glancing around the room one final time, searching desperately for any sign of support. Nobody offered her any. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something close to real relief settle over me. Aunt Brenda was supposed to return to the police station 2 days later for additional questioning. She never showed up. Her husband, Frank, called my mother in a panic that same afternoon, explaining that several of their joint bank accounts had been completely emptied overnight. He had no idea where Aunt Brenda had gone or what she had done with the money. Then came an even more disturbing discovery. A local jewelry shop contacted the family directly after recognizing several pieces matching descriptions Mr. Coleman had circulated, pieces that had originally belonged to Grandma, including a wedding ring and a small collection of antique brooches passed down through generations. Aunt Brenda had sold them weeks earlier, apparently preparing in advance for exactly this kind of situation. She knew this was coming, Uncle Richard said quietly, staring at the printed receipts spread across the kitchen table. She's been planning her escape this entire time. Frank sat slumped in a chair nearby, looking utterly devastated by the woman he had spent decades married to. I had no idea, he kept repeating quietly. I swear I had absolutely no idea. Detectives issued an alert for Aunt Brenda's vehicle within hours, but for now, she had simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and a family still trying to process the full extent of her betrayal. 2 days later, detectives traced one of the jewelry sales back to a storage facility located nearly 40 minutes outside town, rented under a name none of us immediately recognized. When officers opened the unit, they found stacks of cardboard boxes filled with documents, old photographs, and several pieces of furniture that had clearly come directly from Grandma's house. Among the boxes, Investigators discovered most of Grandma's original missing files, the very documents Aunt Brenda had stolen from her office drawer weeks earlier. But tucked beneath several folders, wrapped carefully in a soft cloth, was something none of us had expected to find. A small leather diary, worn at the edges, with Grandma's initials pressed faintly into the cover. Mr. Coleman handled it carefully, examining the spine before handing it directly to my mother, since she was Grandma's oldest surviving child. "This might explain quite a bit," he said quietly. My mother opened the first page slowly, her hands trembling slightly. Grandma's familiar handwriting filled page after page, dated entries stretching back nearly a decade. We gathered around the kitchen table that evening, taking turns reading entries aloud, slowly uncovering a much deeper and far more painful history than any of us had ever realized existed within our own family. The entries painted a picture none of us had ever suspected, careful and detailed records Grandma had kept quietly for years without telling anyone. She wrote about loans given to Aunt Brenda, dozens of them over the years, each one promised to be repaid and never returned. She wrote about emotional pressure, guilt used as a weapon during holidays and family gatherings whenever Grandma hesitated to provide more money. One entry described an argument where Aunt Brenda allegedly threatened to cut off all contact unless Grandma agreed to cover an overdue car payment. Another described tears and apologies the very next day, followed by yet another request for money only weeks later. The pattern repeated itself entry after entry, painting a portrait of manipulation that had clearly worn Grandma down over many years. Then, near the final pages, one entry stood apart from the rest, written in slightly shakier handwriting than the earlier sections. Grandma described discovering something from decades earlier, something she had never previously written about, something involving money meant for someone else entirely. My mother's hands stilled completely as she read the next several lines silently to herself first. "What does it say?" I asked quietly. She looked up slowly, her face pale with shock. "There's more," she said. "Much more than we ever realized." My mother read the entry aloud, her voice trembling with every sentence. Years earlier, when Aunt Brenda was still young, money set aside specifically for her younger brother's college education had quietly disappeared from a family savings account. At the time, everyone assumed the funds had simply been mismanaged through some banking error. But Grandma had recently discovered proof, old bank statements she had kept hidden away for decades, showing that Aunt Brenda herself had withdrawn the money secretly, spending it entirely on herself before anyone noticed it was missing. Grandpa, Grandma's late husband, had apparently discovered the truth shortly after it happened. Rather than expose his own daughter publicly, he had quietly covered the missing amount himself, replacing the stolen funds without ever telling anyone what Aunt Brenda had actually done. He had protected her secret for the rest of his life, allowing everyone to believe the original explanation about a simple banking mistake. The room fell into stunned, heavy silence as the full weight of this older betrayal settled over everyone present. This had never been a single moment of desperation or panic. This was a lifelong pattern, stretching back decades, carefully hidden and quietly enabled by people who loved her too much to confront her honestly. Uncle Richard finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's been doing this her entire life." 3 days later, detectives located Aunt Brenda at a small motel nearly 2 hours away, hiding under a name that wasn't her own. She returned to the family home that same evening, escorted quietly by her lawyer, looking exhausted and noticeably thinner than she had just 1 week earlier. "I only wanted what I deserved," she said quietly, standing in the same dining room where this entire nightmare had first begun. "Grandma always favored everyone else over me. I just wanted to be treated fairly for once." Nobody responded immediately. Then Frank, her own husband, stepped forward, his expression heavy with disappointment rather than anger. "You lied to me for years," he said quietly. "You lied to everyone who loved you. There's no excuse that fixes that now." Nicole stood beside her father, refusing to meet her mother's eyes. "I trusted you," Nicole said softly. "I helped you without even understanding what you were really doing." Aunt Brenda's composure finally broke completely. She began crying, begging for understanding, insisting she had simply made mistakes under pressure she could not fully control. But nobody in that room offered her the comfort she was clearly searching for. For the first time, the people closest to her refused to protect her any longer, refusing to rewrite the truth simply because admitting it hurt too much to bear. A week later, Mr. Coleman gathered the entire family together to formally open Grandma's real, legally verified will, the document she had quietly filed with his office months before her death. The terms were thoughtful, careful, and deeply personal. Most of her remaining assets were divided equally among her children and grandchildren, exactly as everyone had originally expected. But the house itself, the place where I had spent countless hours caring for her during her final years, cooking her meals, managing her medications, sitting beside her during long nights when sleep would not come easily, was left entirely to me. Grandma had specifically written that I had cared for her without ever once asking for anything in return, and she wanted to make sure that love was honored properly. She had also written individual letters for each family member, sealed separately and addressed by name, explaining her reasoning and sharing private memories meant only for them. My letters spoke of summers spent baking together, of quiet afternoons reading on her porch, of gratitude she had never fully expressed while she was still alive. Tears filled my eyes as Mr. Coleman read portions of it aloud, the entire family listening in respectful, healing silence. For the first time since the funeral, the room finally felt like it belonged to family again, rather than suspicion and fear. Months later, Aunt Brenda was formally convicted of fraud and forgery, ordered by the court to repay the estate for everything she had taken, including the money from the storage unit sale and the original stolen documents. She avoided prison time, but her reputation within the family was permanently and completely shattered. The rest of us slowly began rebuilding what conflict and suspicion had nearly destroyed entirely. My mother apologized to me quietly one afternoon, her eyes filled with genuine regret. "I should have trusted you from the very beginning," she said softly. "I'm sorry I didn't." One by one, other family members offered similar apologies, some awkward, some tearful, but all of them sincere in their own way. That Thanksgiving, we gathered together at Grandma's house, now legally mine, sitting around the same table where this entire nightmare had first begun months earlier. Before dinner, we read Grandma's final letter together one more time, her words filling the quiet room like a gentle, lasting presence. Looking around at my family, finally healed and honest with each other again, I realized something important. Grandma's greatest gift to us was never really the house itself. It was the painful, necessary exposure of greed and dishonesty that had been quietly poisoning our family for years, long before any of us were brave enough to see it clearly. If this story moved you, like, subscribe, and tell me below what you would have done in my place.